The metallic clink of Dr. Catherine Hayes' heels echoed down the dimly lit corridor of Meadowridge Animal Shelter's restricted section. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, mingling with something more somber, the quiet resignation of lives deemed unworthy of saving. In her hand, she clutched a clipboard, the euthanasia authorization form already signed. The ink was barely dry. At the end of the hall, behind the heavy steel door marked Procedure Room B, a single soul awaited his fate. Max, once he had been a magnificent creature, a German shepherd in peak condition, muscles taut, eyes sharp, his every movement exuding discipline. But now, he was a shadow of that former glory. His once thick coat was patchy and dull, his ribs jutted out beneath fragile skin, and his breath came in slow, labored intervals. His eyes, clouded and vacant, barely flickered in response as Dr. Hayes entered his cage. "Come on, boy," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper, as she reached for the worn leather leash looped around his frail neck. Her fingers trembled. She had done this countless times before, but something about this one felt different. Max didn't resist. He didn't struggle. That was the worst part. He merely followed with sluggish obedience, his paws dragging against the cold, sterile tiles. There was no fight left in him. As they neared the procedure room, Dr. Hayes felt an inexplicable tightness in her chest. She had told herself 1,000 times, this was mercy. The shelter had neither the funds nor the resources to diagnose whatever illness had been wasting him away. The kindest thing to do was to let him go peacefully, rather than let him wither in pain. Still, she hesitated. The small window on the procedure room door revealed the table already prepped, a tray of syringes lined neatly beside it. Everything was routine. Everything was in place. And yet, why did this one feel different? Max took another slow step forward. The leash in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Dr. Hayes exhaled sharply, forcing herself to move. This was the right thing to do. Her hand reached for the door handle. Then, "Stop! Please stop!" The voice was piercing, raw with desperation. The shock of it sent a jolt through Dr. Hayes' body as she nearly dropped the leash. She turned just in time to see a small blonde-haired girl burst through the staff-only doors, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. Behind her, a breathless woman appeared, her face stricken with confusion and alarm. And Max. Max, who had not reacted to anything in days, lifted his head. Dr. Catherine Hayes froze, the air suddenly charged with an urgency that didn't belong in the quiet sterility of the euthanasia wing. The voice, shrill, desperate, seemed to cut through the stillness like a knife. She barely had time to turn before a small blonde-haired girl burst into the hallway, her tiny feet pounding against the cold tile floor. Her wide blue eyes brimmed with tears, her face flushed with frantic emotion. "Please don't! Please stop!" The girl's voice cracked with the force of her plea, her little body trembling as she threw herself forward, sliding to her knees just inches from Max. Behind her, a breathless woman, her mother presumably, appeared in the doorway, her face a mix of confusion and alarm. "Lily, you can't be in here!" The woman gasped, her voice edged with panic. But Lily wasn't listening. She reached out, her small hands hesitant yet fearless, fingers stretching toward Max. The old shepherd, barely responsive for days, shifted ever so slightly. His ears, which had remained limp and unresponsive for weeks, twitched at the sound of the child's voice. Then, impossibly, he lifted his head, just a fraction, just enough to meet her gaze. Dr. Hayes felt her breath hitch in her throat. Max had been catatonic for days. He had stopped responding to food, to touch, even to the soft coaxing of the shelter volunteers. But now, at this moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, a distant memory, a connection. Lily, undeterred by the weight of the moment, reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out something small, something carefully folded. With trembling fingers, she unfolded a child's drawing. Crude, simple lines of a German shepherd standing next to a stick figure girl. Above it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "I'll be your friend." Dr. Hayes, grip tightened around the clipboard pressed against her chest, the euthanasia authorization form suddenly feeling grotesque in her hands. Madeline Carter, Lily's mother, took a step forward, her voice laced with confusion. "Honey, how do you know this dog?" Lily didn't look away from Max. Her voice was quieter now, but steadier. "Because he's my daddy's dog." The words settled over the room like a thunderclap. Doctor, Hayes felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. Madeline's face went pale. Lily, that's not possible. We've never been here before. But Lily only lifted the drawing higher, her voice filled with quiet certainty. I knew we'd find him. Silence settled over the room like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. Dr. Hayes felt her pulse quicken, her grip tightening on the clipboard as she stared at the little girl. He's my daddy's dog, Lily had said, her voice laced with an unshakable certainty. Madeline Carter knelt beside her daughter, confusion etched deep into her features. Sweetheart, she said softly, choosing her words carefully. I know you want to help this dog, but there's no way he could be your father's. We've never been here before. We don't know this dog. But Lily didn't waver. She turned toward her mother, blue eyes blazing with something fierce and unwavering. Look at his ear, she insisted. Daddy told me. He has a mark. Dr. Hayes inhaled sharply, a sense of unease crawling up her spine. She knew Max had a tattoo, most likely an old identification number from his past, something the intake staff had overlooked when labeling him just another stray. But the way Lily spoke, so sure, so absolute. Without waiting for permission, Lily scrambled forward, pressing herself against the bars of Max's kennel. It's okay, she whispered, her tiny fingers reaching carefully through the gaps, trembling but fearless. I found you. And then, before anyone could stop her, Max moved. The German Shepherd, who had been wasting away in silence for weeks, whose body had been shutting down before their eyes, shifted with great effort, dragging himself forward inch by agonizing inch. His cloudy eyes locked onto Lily's, and with a final burst of strength, he nudged his muzzle against her outstretched hand. Dr. Hayes exhaled sharply. That's not possible, she murmured under her breath. Madeline turned to the vet, desperation and confusion fighting for dominance on her face. You said he wasn't responding to anyone. Why now? Why her? Dr. Hayes shook her head. I don't know. But Lily did. Carefully, as if handling something sacred, she pressed her small palm flat against Max's fur, right between his ears. The dog let out a sound, a deep, broken whimper, a sound of longing, of relief. Then, Lily whispered the words that would change everything. His name is Max, she said. He worked with my daddy. He saved him. Dr. Hayes felt her breath catch. That name, Max. It hadn't been on any of the shelter's records. It hadn't been written anywhere. And yet, as if to confirm the impossible, Max gave a single weak wag of his tail. Dr. Catherine Hayes barely had time to process the weight of Lily's words before the heavy footfalls of approaching authority broke the charged silence. Richard Holloway, the shelter director, loomed in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled irritation. What's going on here? His voice was clipped, impatient. His sharp eyes swept across the room, taking in the open cage, the unauthorized visitors, and the German Shepherd that, against all odds, was now pressing himself against the little girl, as if she were the only thing tethering him to life. Madeline Carter instinctively placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. This is my husband's dog, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. He served with him in the military. Holloway scoffed. That's touching, but it doesn't change anything. This dog is on today's euthanasia list for a reason. He's sick, deteriorating. Prolonging this will only cause more suffering. Max let out a weak but unmistakable growl. Dr. Hayes saw something flicker in Holloway's expression. Was it unease? She squared her shoulders. I want to have him examined by an outside veterinarian before anything is done. If there's even a chance this is a service dog who served in combat, we owe him that. Holloway's jaw tightened. That's not your call, Dr. Hayes. The paperwork is finalized. The resources aren't here to care for him. This is happening today. Lily's grip on Max's fur tightened. You can't take him, she said, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. He's my daddy's dog. He belongs with us. Something about the way she said it, a certainty that defied all logic, sent a ripple through the room. Dr. Hayes knew they didn't have time for bureaucracy. If they hesitated, Holloway would ensure Max never left that shelter alive. We're taking him, Madeline said, her voice brooking no argument. Holloway took a step forward. You don't have that authority. But Dr. Hayes did. With a sharp, decisive motion, she ripped the euthanasia form from her clipboard and tore it in two. Gasps rippled through the staff members nearby. Holloway's face darkened with rage. "I'll take full responsibility," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "Max is leaving this shelter, now." For a moment, time stood still. Then Madeline bent down, looping her arms beneath Max's frail body. He was too weak to stand, but he didn't fight. He trusted them. Holloway's fists clenched, but he didn't stop them. Maybe he couldn't. As they carried Max toward the exit, Lily whispered to him, her breath warm against his ear. "I told you I'd find you." The drive to Dr. Evelyn Carter's veterinary clinic was a blur. The rhythmic hum of the road beneath them was the only sound breaking the tense silence, aside from Max's shallow breathing. Madeline kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching her daughter cradle the dog's head in her lap. Lily's tiny fingers stroked Max's fur gently, whispering words too soft for her mother to hear. Dr. Carter, a seasoned veterinarian with decades of experience, took one look at Max upon their arrival and immediately ordered a full diagnostic workup. As the vet techs wheeled the German Shepherd away for x-rays and blood tests, Madeline's stomach churned with unease. Hours passed, and when Dr. Carter finally emerged from the exam room, her face was lined with concern. "His condition is critical," she admitted, her voice measured but heavy with something deeper, something unsettling. "He's suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and something else." Madeline's brow furrowed. "Something else?" Dr. Carter nodded, handing over a folder filled with preliminary test results. "His symptoms, weakness, tremors, disorientation, aren't just from starvation. There are traces of an unidentified compound in his blood, something not typically found in an animal's system." A slow, creeping dread slithered down Madeline's spine. "What kind of compound?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "It's unclear, but it's not a naturally occurring toxin. Someone either administered this to him intentionally, or he was exposed in a controlled environment." A lead weight settled in Madeline's chest. She thought back to Holloway's insistence on euthanasia, his almost aggressive push to get rid of Max as soon as possible. What if he was poisoned?" she whispered, almost afraid to hear the words aloud. Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. "It's possible." The thought made Madeline's skin crawl. She clenched her fists. How many other dogs had been put down without anyone asking questions? A knock on the door broke her spiraling thoughts. Dr. Hayes stood there, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding up a stack of confidential shelter records. Madeline's pulse pounded as she scanned the pages. Dates, case numbers, medical logs, and then a pattern. A sickening realization settled in. Max wasn't the first. He was just the first to survive. Madeline sat frozen, the shelter records spread out before her like the pieces of a gruesome puzzle. Each document told a story. Dogs, most of them large breeds, all labeled as unadoptable, all marked for euthanasia within weeks of arrival. But what sent a chill racing down her spine was what they had in common. They had all shown the same symptoms as Max: tremors, lethargy, organ failure, and they had all died before anyone could ask questions. "Doctor," Hayes leaned over the table, her face tight with anger. "This isn't neglect. This is a pattern." She pointed at the documents, her finger tracing the dates. 12 dogs, all within the last 6 months. Madeline felt a sick realization settle in her chest. Holloway knew. Dr. Carter's expression was grim. If Max hadn't survived long enough for us to notice, he would have been another statistic. Lily, who had been sitting quietly beside Max, lifted her head, her small voice piercing through the heavy silence. "He was trying to get rid of them." Madeline swallowed hard. "Or worse, using them." Dr. Hayes nodded. "I've seen this before. Some shelters cut corners, but this is something else. What if they weren't just euthanizing these dogs?" Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. What if they were testing on them? The words sent a shudder through the room. Madeline grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "We need to report this." But before she could press call, Dr. Hayes held up a hand. "Not yet." Madeline blinked. "What do you mean, not yet? We have proof." Dr. Hayes' voice was low, urgent. "We need more. We need to know what they were given, who was involved. If we go in now, Holloway will cover his tracks before anyone can hold him accountable." Madeline clenched her fists. The thought of waiting made her stomach churn. But she knew Dr. Hayes was right. Lily, still cradling Max's head, looked up at her mother with solemn determination. Daddy always said, you never leave a soldier behind. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, running her fingers through Max's fur, feeling the frail but steady rise and fall of his chest. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about all the dogs that hadn't made it. Madeline took a deep breath. Then, let's bring them down. The night was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that made the air feel thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Madeline sat in the dimly lit waiting room of Dr. Carter's clinic, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Across from her, Lily sat curled in a chair, her little fingers tangled in the fabric of her sweater, her wide eyes fixed on the closed door to the treatment room. Max was inside, and he was slipping away. Dr. Carter had done everything she could. Fluids, stabilizers, emergency medications, nothing seemed to be enough. The damage had been too extensive, the poison lingering too long in his system. His breathing had become erratic, his body trembling with each shallow inhale. We need to prepare for the worst, Dr. Carter had said softly an hour earlier. He's fought hard, but you should be ready. Madeline wasn't ready. Neither was Lily. A sharp, broken whimper came from behind the door. Lily's head snapped up. He's scared, she whispered. Before Madeline could stop her, Lily was off her chair and moving. She shoved the door open with both hands and rushed into the room. Max lay stretched out on the examination table, his once powerful frame reduced to frail bones and weakened muscle. His breaths were slow, labored, each one seeming to take more effort than the last. His ears twitched at the sound of Lily's voice. "Max," Lily whispered, stepping closer. Dr. Carter looked up in alarm, ready to usher the girl out, but Madeline shook her head. "Let her." Lily climbed onto a stool beside the table, leaning down until her lips were inches from Max's ear. And then softly, she began to sing. It was an old lullaby, one that her father used to sing to her at night, the same one he had hummed to his loyal companion during long deployments, when both man and dog had only each other in the darkness. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. Max's body was still. For a long, terrible moment, Madeline thought he was already gone. But then a twitch, a flicker of movement in his clouded eyes. Then the weakest, most fragile sound, a slow, rattling exhale. And with it, Max's tail, barely more than a breath of motion, thumped once against the table. Dr. Carter's eyes widened. Lily didn't stop singing. And Max, against all odds, kept breathing. The town square was alive with hushed anticipation. A sea of faces gathered beneath the midday sun. Flags fluttered gently in the breeze, the murmurs of the crowd barely covering the soft tapping of polished boots against the pavement. A wooden podium stood at the center, draped in military insignia, a stark reminder that this was more than just a ceremony. It was a reckoning, a moment of justice, long overdue. And at the heart of it all, Max sat proudly beside Lily, his once frail body now stronger, his eyes, once dulled by pain, alive with something fierce and unwavering. His coat, though still marked by scars, gleamed in the sunlight. A dark green service vest rested snugly on his frame, adorned with a single medal pinned just above his heart. Madeline stood beside them, her heart pounding as Colonel James Harrison of the 101st Airborne Division stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on the dog at his feet. He cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying over the square. "This," he began, gesturing toward Max, "is not just a dog." His voice carried the weight of reverence, the kind reserved for fallen soldiers and lost comrades. "This is a soldier, a warrior, a hero." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some wiped at their eyes, others stood at rigid attention. He was left behind. The colonel continued, his expression darkening. Discarded by a system that should have honored him. Yet, against all odds, he survived. Because that's what soldiers do. Madeline swallowed hard, her hands tightening around Lily's small shoulders. The colonel turned to the girl, his tone softening. But he didn't do it alone. He had someone fighting for him. Lily, her face solemn beyond her years, lifted her chin. The colonel knelt, pinning the Distinguished Service Medal onto Max's vest. The crowd erupted in applause, but Max barely flinched. Instead, he turned his head toward Lily and nudged her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had saved them both. Tears blurred Madeline's vision as she watched the two of them stand side by side. One child, one soldier, both survivors. Then, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, Max lifted his head toward the sky and let out a single, powerful bark, a soldier's final salute, a mission at last complete. In the end, Max's story is not just about survival. It is about redemption, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. It is a testament to the resilience of the forgotten, the abandoned, and the overlooked. Against all odds, a dying war dog found his way home, not just to a family, but to the heart of a nation that had almost let him slip away. His journey was one of second chances, not only for himself, but for Lily, who found her voice in the fight to save him. It was about healing, not just of the body, but of the soul. In saving Max, Lily found her own strength, proving that sometimes those who are most in need of rescue become the ones who save us in return. Yet, Max's story is not unique. Every year, thousands of service animals, abandoned pets, and shelter dogs are left to suffer, their loyalty repaid with neglect. How many of them are quietly waiting for someone to see their worth? How many Maxes are still out there hoping for a second chance? This story is a call to action, to respect, protect, and honor the animals that have stood beside us. They are more than just pets. They are companions, guardians, and, in many cases, silent heroes. If a little girl's unwavering love could save a dying war dog, imagine what we could do as a society if we chose to care just a little more. No soldier should be left behind. No loyal heart should be forgotten.